بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Inshallah, we will continue in our reading of the book حلية طالب العلم, the etiquette of the seeker of knowledge, or the adornment of the seeker of knowledge, by Shaykh Bakr Abu Zaid rahimahullah. Last week we just read the introduction alongside the sharh of Ibn Uthaymin rahimahullah, and today we'll begin the first chapter, which the Shaykh gives the title, the etiquette of the seeker's inner self, or adab talib fi nafsihi, the etiquette of the student in relation to his own self. And this is important because he begins with the most important part, which is how the seeker of knowledge should be worried about his intention and about the manners in which he seeks knowledge and the reasons for which he is seeking it. So the Shaykh, he begins, Shaykh Bakr Abu Zaid rahimahullah, with a point, Al-Ilm ibadah. The first point, knowledge is worship. And so what he does here in the first chapter, he breaks it into approximately 15 different points. The first being Al-Ilm ibadah, knowledge is worship. And he says then the principle of all principles mentioned in this book, as well as the principle of every required action, is your understanding that knowledge is worship. Some of the scholars have said, knowledge is a secretive prayer and the worship of the heart. Therefore, the conditions of worship are the following. So, al-ilm, knowledge and seeking it, it's ibadah. It's worship. And therefore, you need to have a proper intention. And this is what he's going to get into. Because any action which doesn't have the correct intention, then it will not be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a footnote, the Shaykh, he says, you can refer to the fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, in which he discusses this in length, and he mentions a long list. And that's one of the things that Shaykh Bakr rahimahullah is known for, is his exactness in research and his footnotes. Means the fawaid that he brings in his book are very detailed and very subtle. So inshallah we will pause as much as we can to just highlight some of them, because he mentions a lot. So the first benefit, if you want to know more about knowledge as an act of worship, refer to the Fatawa of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and Majmu' Fatawa in volume number 10. And he mentions all of the pages, as you can see, for those who have the text. And this statement that he mentioned here, Al-ilmu salatu sir wa ibadatul qalb, that knowledge is a secretive prayer and the worship of the heart. In the English translation it's not mentioned, but in the Arabic it says it's taken from Faisal Qaadir of Imam Al-Munawi rahimahullah. So Imam Al-Munawi rahimahullah and Faisal Qaadir, he said, وَقَدْ قِيل, it was said, Al-ilmu salatu sir wa ibadatul qalb, and he continues. So it's a fa'idah that this statement is actually attributed to Imam Al-Munawi in his book Faisal Qaadir, volume 6, page 183. And then the Shaykh says, then the conditions for worship then are two. And he starts then mentioning them. Or it says the conditions of worship are the following. And before we get into there, Shaykh Uthaymin rahimahullah says that al-ilm, knowledge is worship without doubt. Rather, it is the most noble of the acts of worship and the greatest of them. Such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has mentioned in His book, in discussion about striving the path of Allah, وَمَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً وَلَفَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِنْهُمْ طَائِفَةً ليتفقهوا في الدين ولينذروا قومهم إلى رجعوا إليهم لعلهم يحذرون. Surah Tawbah 122, Allah says that it is not befitting that all the believers go out at once. Or all of them go out. Means in the path of Allah. Rather, from every group amongst them, let there be a group who will stay back in order to teach the people and allow them to understand their religion and remind them until they return. And so we will benefit from this. He says that this ta'ifa that's sitting back, what is their intention, what is their benefit, in order to understand the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so to show you, despite even the value and the excellence of going out and striving to protect the deen and defend it, seeking knowledge is also there, and it's just as virtuous. Rather, Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, مَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. When Allah, He wants good for someone, He gives him understanding of the religion. Hadith Bukhari and Muslim, Hadith Muawiyah radiyallahu anhum. So he says, الْفِقْهُ هُوَ الْعِلْمُ بِالشَّرْعِ. Fiqh is a knowledge of the legislation. فيدخل فيه علم العقائد والتوحيد وغير ذلك. And enter into this is knowledge of the beliefs and the creed, knowledge of Tawheed and other than it. And then the Shaykh Ibn Abdul he mentions, rahimahullah, a nice benefit. For someone may ask, what's the intention of seeking knowledge? Why should we be seeking knowledge? What are we supposed to have in our heart as the intention? He says, Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, is described to him that he said, Al-ilmu la ya'diluhu shay'un liman sahhat niyatuhu. That knowledge, there is nothing equivalent to it for the one whose intention is correct. So they said, وَكَيْفَ تَصِحُّ النِّيَّةِ. How will someone validate or correct his intention? And so he says, rahimahullah, Imam Ahmad, يَنْوِي رَفْعَ الْجَهْلِ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَعَنْ غَيْرِهِ. And so this should be something which we remind ourselves often. That the intention of seeking knowledge is to remove the ignorance from your own self and others. This is the intention. It isn't to appear in front of the people that you have knowledge. It isn't to take over the sittings of knowledge. It's not in order to gain worldly life. Rather, this is a benefit, to remove from yourself ignorance, and then those outside of yourself means you others. And so we benefit from here. This is the way we should be. This should be our intention. So the Shaykh says here, from conditions of worship are, number one, sincerity. Al-ikhlas, in the intention for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to Allah's statement, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ حُنَفًا. That they were not commanded except that they should worship Allah and worship none but Him alone, abstaining from ascribing partners to Him. Surah Al-Bayyinah, ayah 5. And we also find in the famous hadith, which was narrated through only one chain, upon the authority of the commander of the believers, Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has said, actions are but by intentions. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. The actions are really judged by intentions. So here we take a benefit that the person should have the correct intention if you're seeking knowledge, which is to remove ignorance from your own self and then those around you, means other people. The intention is so important. So the Shaykh then says, so if knowledge is devoid of sincere intention, then it is transformed from being amongst the most noble acts of worship to being one of the lowest forms of violation. And there is nothing that destroys the blessings of knowledge as much as riyah, showing off. Be riyah of shirk or riyah of ikhlas. So here we take a benefit that someone's intention is corrupted when seeking knowledge. It ruins the act. It's no longer worship. It becomes now something of showing off, or it could even be falling into shirk if someone is seeking it solely for these benefits of people and worldly benefits. Shaykh Ibn Abdul, he mentions here that what is and should be the intention of the student of knowledge. The intention of the student of knowledge should be the following. Number one, when you seek knowledge, you're hoping imtithal amrillah. You want to adhere to the commands of Allah. Because when you learn, you find out what Allah wants from you and you do it. Allah says, فَعَلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. No, there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah. وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لِذَنْبِكَ. Then seek forgiveness for your sins. So Allah begins first with knowledge and encouraging us to know and to have love and pleasure of the command. Number two, the intention for a student knowledge is حِفْظُ الشَّرِيعَةِ اللَّهِ. You want to preserve and protect the religion and the legislation of Allah. And how much do we need to do this nowadays? When everybody is speaking about the deen however they wish. Everyone has an opinion. And there are some people who, in fact, they have an intention to probably destroy the Muslims from within, due to the ignorance and maybe sometimes even the hypocrisy. So the Shaykh is here to protect the Sharia by learning and to preserve it in the chest of the people and in writing. For preservation of knowledge, it can be done through the hearts, memorizing the matan, the books, the hadith, Quran, the hadith, or through the writings. You write, you record. قَيِّدُ الْعِلْمِ بِالْكِتَابِ الْحَدِيث. Secure knowledge of writing it. Hadith Anas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. So the benefit is that to protect the deen, so the knowledge isn't lost, and also that it is not corrupted by those who are trying to corrupt it or who are trying to who are not proficient in it. Number three, حماية الشريعة ودفاع عنها, to protect the legislation and defend against it from the attacks of the people. So the first one, you're preserving the knowledge itself, so it can be passed on, transmitted. Whereas the third, you are trying to protect it against those who are attacking it. He says this is for a great benefit. For if it wasn't for the ulama, means after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserving this legislation, who would then defend it? And he mentions here then, you find many examples like Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and others, going through great trials and tribulations from the people of innovation in relation or in regards to preserving this legislation. Fourth, اتباع شريعة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. So that you may practice the sunnah and the legislation of Rasul صلى الله عليه وسلم, which can only be done by your own intention. By your own learning of the knowledge. So these four, he says, the Shaykh, is what you should be in your heart when it comes to sincerity. And number one, you're trying to adhere to the commands of Allah. And number two, you're trying to preserve the Sharia. Memorize it, learn it, record it. And thirdly, protect it, defend it against those who are attacking it and undermining it. And fourthly, to adhere to the Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Here, Shaykh Bakr rahimahullah, he mentions that there's two types of Riya. Riya al-Shirk wa Riya al-Ikhlas. What's the difference between the two? This is important because he mentioned it in passing. So in the footnotes, the translator, he put a footnote to help us understand that. Because Shaykh Bakr rahimahullah, he mentioned it, but he didn't explain it. And so here we want to explain to the ulama, they mention, some of the ulama, that there's a difference between something called Riya al-Shirk and Riya Ikhlas. Here I'll read a statement from Al-Gharrafi rahimahullah. And here is a benefit because sometimes these small differences you might not know. So he says here, Al-Gharrafi al-Maliki rahimahullah, and this is where one of the footnotes, that one of the sources that in the translator puts in the footnote. He says that وَالْحَقِيقَةُ الرِّيَا, the actual reality of Riya, أَيَعْمَلُ طَاعَ لِلَّهِ وَلِلنَّاسِ. The reality of Riya is when someone does an action for Allah and for other than Allah, means for the people. So many of us, we know when you do an action, you're intending for Allah, and then somewhere in there you might have been intending for the people. He says, وَيُسَمَّى, this one is called Riya al-Shirk, because there's an action of tashriq going on. You began with Allah, and then in there something happened, shaitan told you, people are listening to you or seeing you, and then you change your intention or you mixed it. This one is called Riya al-Shirk, when you have an intention for Allah and the people. He says, أَوْ لِلنَّاسِ خَاصَةً. If the intention is solely for the people, when someone just got up to pray just for the people who are seeing him, it's not for Allah even. He said this one is Riya al-Ikhlas. It's called the Riya al-Ikhlas because it's khalisa. It's khalisa, it's purely for the people. So it's a benefit we take then, that the difference between the two. وَكِلَاهُمَا, he said, يَصِيرُ طَاعَ مَعْصِيَةً. Both of them anyways make it act of obedience to become disobedience. So Riya al-Shirk, when you do an action for Allah and the people. Of course, all actions for Allah, but then when the Riya comes, your intention gets polluted. But if someone does an action solely for the people, that's Riya al-Ikhlas, because it's sincerely for the people, it's an action which is not accepted, it's an act of shirk, an act of misguidance. So the benefit we take from this statement. Then Shaykh Bakr, he says, or tasmi', which means to be heard. So we have Riya, to be seen, and Sum'a, to be heard. Means some wishing to be heard. For example, the musmi', the one who is being showing off by way of hearing, he says to the people, I know such and such, or I've memorized such and such. So that's an example of the type of Riya. You come to the people and say, I memorized this many books and this many things. Or I know this mas'ala and that mas'ala. And it's not about competition and learning, it's about showing off to the people. Because إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Perhaps maybe someone will ask you, did you memorize this? In that situation you answer, yes, I memorized this. We will not say this Riya. Someone asks you a question, but just to boast to the people what you know, this is type of Riya, and also Sum'a, to be heard. Very important. And Salaf Salih were not like that. As it comes, I believe in Kitab Al-Ilm of Khaythama, rahimahullah, that the Salaf, they wouldn't like to proclaim to the people that which they memorized, that which they knew. It means they have ilm, but they were not people who proclaim their knowledge. And sometimes some of them they wouldn't know the extent of their knowledge, except through the answers and the questions and the tests or whatever it may be, that people find out this person is extremely knowledgeable. So for us, we take a benefit that if someone is trying to make people hear what he memorized, type of Riya, type of Sum'a, it's haram, it shouldn't be the way. So I believe I should be careful of that. He says, therefore adhere to freeing yourself from everything that blemishes your intention of seeking knowledge, such as love for standing out, rising above your colleagues, and turning them into objects of achieving hidden objectives and obtaining worldly pleasures, such as wealth, glory, fame, praiseworthiness, or intending to turn people's faces in your direction. For these and other similar things that are such that if they blemish one's intention, they will corrupt it, and their blessings from knowledge will be lost. For this reason, it is incumbent upon you to protect your intention for all the traces of seeking with your knowledge the pleasure of other than Allah, the Most High, yet it is incumbent to be aware of the things which lead to these evil qualities. So here we take a benefit that the student of knowledge, the first thing he should be doing is protecting his intention. And so here Shaykh Ibn Abdul mentions, and when he talks about this issue, that there's actually a subtle point here. What's the difference between حب الظهور وحب النفع عن الناس? The love for wanting to be known and to be prominent amongst people, and love that you wish to benefit the people. Because we know if you don't become prominent amongst the people, then no one will benefit from you. In that you won't get to sit and teach the people. But what's the difference between that and someone who wants to he loves to benefit them, and if he wishes to benefit, he needs to be prominent. He says the difference between the two is that the person who wants to benefit the people, he doesn't love to be known and to be apparent. And if it is not apparent, it doesn't bother him. But the one who just wants to be apparent and to be prominent, this person's intention is just that. So it's very important. Sometimes we know, in order to teach people, sometimes people have to come and sit with you, and you might have to put in front of the people in the khutbah. But if your intention is to benefit the people, then inshallah your intention is sincere. If nobody comes, you still teach. If everyone comes, you're still teaching. And we take a benefit then that sometimes those subtleties we have to examine. What's your intention? And sometimes it's important to know that student knowledge gets confused, because the intention can change. And Shaykh's going to get to that. How about, Shaykh says, the issue of competition in knowledge. Is this something which is prohibited or part of these type of blameworthy things? He says, al-munafasa ghayru hadha. Competition in knowledge is not like this. It means it's good to compete and to try to precede your fellow students, because this will all encourage the increase in knowledge and also the progression of the benefit. So it's important then that someone competes. Well, obviously, the competition should be for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then, Shaykh Bakr, he mentions that there are a number of sayings and occurrences that I mentioned at the beginning of the first chapter of my book, At-Ta'alum. And we mentioned that book last week, and he mentions it again, because he wrote the book At-Ta'alum before he wrote this book. So the Ta'alum is is the action of pretending to have knowledge, feigning knowledge or pretending to have knowledge. So he says, I would also like to mention, along with those things I mentioned in that book, that things that should be prohibited, that the student of knowledge should prohibit himself from, is a prohibition of the issue the scholars have referred to as at-tubuliyat, meaning the controversial issues, which are mentioned in order to achieve fame. So some things the ulama call at-tubuliyat. It comes from the word tabal, right? The word means like a drum. These are issues which somebody does this, or he gets into these issues in order to become known by way of controversy. Controversial issues by which you are known by them because they're merely controversial. There's no benefit in them. And some of the earlier scholars, they mentioned this, some of the khusumat, the debates that happened between some of the scholars, just taburiyat. They were getting into controversial issues which are just to be known from. Like Ibn Jawzi mentions this term. And he says that it was said by one of the poets, or one of the Arab grammarians, زَلَّةُ الْعَالِمْ مَضْرُوبٌ لَهَا طَبْرٌ, that the drums are struck for the mistake of the scholar. So he says these issues are really there to achieve fame. So someone should avoid them, getting into controversial issues or holding controversial opinions just for being known. And how many times we find this today? Someone, he may discuss an issue for the sake of its controversy, so he become known, everyone knows. He's the one who said this is such and such opinion. And in the books, there are people who are known for this, who got written the biographies or the history for that. That's their legacy and knowledge. They got into controversial issues. I will mention an example shortly. Then he says it was narrated from Sufyan al-Thawri. The translation says Sufyan al-Thawri, but what's correct is Sufyan ibn Uyaynah. So if someone has the English translation, make correction. It says Sufyan al-Thawri. What's more correct is Sufyan ibn Uyaynah, rahimahullah. That it was said to him, he said, I was blessed with the understanding of the Quran. And when I upturned the money purse, the understanding was taken away from me. What does he mean by this statement? Shaykh Uthaymin, he says, before getting into it, at-tabuliyat, or issues which are just there to become famous for. They're called tabuliyat because they resemble the tabal, the drum. لها صوت ورنين. It has a sound and has vibration. فإذا جاء في مسألة غريبة على الناس واشتهرت عنه صارت كأنها صوت طبل. If someone becomes famous for a particular issue which is controversial, it's like someone beating a drum. Everyone can hear it. Everyone knows about it. So in reality, this is something we should avoid it. As for the statement of Sufyan ibn Uyaynah, rahimahullah, Then here it's ascribed to the book Tadhkiratu Sami' wal Mutakallim of Ibn Jama'ah. And in the authentication and verification of the book by Shaykh Abu Amr al-Hajuri, he mentions, Hafidullah, that Ibn Jawzi mentions the book in this statement in Al-Muntazam, which is a book of history. Wallahu a'lam fi sihhatihi. He didn't mention it, and it's not clear. But what we take from the statement is that Sufyan ibn Uyayna is saying that he once had understanding of the Quran. And then he took some of the gifts from the rulers. And after he took that gift, that his understanding was removed from him. So Shaykh Uthaymeen comments saying, what is intended by this is the Ataya bin Sultan, the gift from the ruler. Then when we accepted it, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Suliba fahm al-Quran. The understanding of the Quran was taken from him. And what is intended by this kind of gift is the gifts which are intended to make the scholar incline towards the ruler and then become a scholar who will say whatever he wishes. Not just his gift alone. So Ibn Taymiyyah says it's not allowed for the scholar to accept the gift from the ruler. إذا كان السلطان يريد أن تكون هذه عطية مطية له يركبها متى شاء. It is not permissible for the scholar to take the gift of the ruler if his intention is to make him like a riding animal, which he can ride the scholar however he wants. Means he gives him, so he gives the opinions or fatwa for his sake. In that case, it's haram. But otherwise, if it gives it to you without asking, without someone seeking it, then the Rasul said, حديث to Umar, or حديث Umar, ما جاءك من هذا المال وأنت غير مشرف ولا سائر فخذه. Whatever comes to you from this wealth, without you asking nor desiring it, then take it. وما لا فلا تتبعه نفسك. As for what is not like this, then don't tire yourself out in search of it. Hadith Bukhari and Muslim. So we take a benefit there that the student of knowledge intention should be pure. If he's seeking knowledge then, for example, to gain fame and money and salary, what do you think then will happen to his fahm? If Sufyan ibn Uyayna narrates that he lost the fahm because of this, what about then those who just want to become famous? Those intention is to seek knowledge just so they can become the Shaykh or the YouTube star, and he's not intending true knowledge or true benefit. It's very dangerous. So all of us, is a reminder for all of us that we seek knowledge not for the worldly gains, and also that we don't make our knowledge or our pursuit of knowledge like this. As for those who indulge in controversial issues, then there are some scholars, Shaykh Bakr Zaid rahimahullah, he mentions in his Kitab al-Ta'alum, he mentions actually many examples of people who were pretenders of knowledge and they were exposed. And I'll mention one story because it is interesting, but also it reminds us not to be like such people. He says, وَمِنْهُمْ, from those who are pretenders of knowledge, is a Shaykh or a man named Al-Harawi Shams bin Ata Al-Razi. He passed away 887 Hijri. And this Shaykh, he says, he was one who, in reality, he was asked once as a type of imtihan, majlis imtihan. They had a sitting to test his knowledge. This is not far-fetched. We know some of the Salaf they were tested to see what their status is in their knowledge. So they asked him, هل ورد النص على أن المغرب تقصر في السفر? Is there any text that's been reported that you're allowed to shorten your Salat al-Maghrib when you're traveling? So most of us, we know you can't shorten Maghrib in the travel. So he said, نعم, there is. So they said, جاء ذلك من حديث جابر في كتاب الفردوس لأبي ليث السمرقندي. He said there is a hadith reported from Jabir in the book of Firdaus, written by Abu Layth as-Samarqandi. So the people then, they hastened to go find the book, and they got it and they found it's not there. So they came back to him and they said to him, well, we read in the book, it is not there. He said, you don't know, there's 3 types of this book. There's the Kubra, the Wusta, and the Sughra. Major version, the minor, the middle, and the minor. In this situation, this narration comes in the major one, it doesn't exist in this land. So after he said this, everyone knew he was a liar. He said that day, فَاسْتَشْعِرُوا كَذِبُهُ مِنْ يَوْمِ إِذٍ. Everyone knew that day he was a liar. And then Ibn Hajar, he narrates the story, and he was actually written as those who were muta'alimin, those are pretenders of knowledge. Because not only did he lie about the source, he even pretended they didn't exist. Subhanallah. And he mentions many more of Shaykh Bakr in this book, so if someone returns to it, you'll find many interesting and sometimes very funny stories. So this type of knowledge or this type of controversy is something which a student of knowledge should avoid. And even if someone were to make a mistake in his knowledge, then it's only to retract. But not as this situation, the one who is continuing. Then he says, Shaykh Bakr rahimahullah, so hold fast. May Allah shower His knowledge, shower His mercy upon you to the most trustworthy handhold, which is sincerity. that will save you from these fatal blemishes by becoming, along with exerting yourself and becoming sincere, very fearful of anything that nullifies it, means the sincerity, and displaying great poverty to Allah, along with turning to Him sincerity. It was narrated that Sufyan ibn Sa'id al-Thawri rahimahullah said, I did not treat anything more difficult than my sincerity. This is a very famous statement that many of the scholars, they mention this. The Sufyan al-Thawri rahimahullah said, ما عالجت شيئا أشد علي من نيتي. I never struggled with something, worked more difficult on than my own intention. And Shaykh Uthaymeen commenting on this says that لا أدري هل هو قول آخر أو نقل بمعنى. Means I'm not sure if the Shaykh Bakr quoted this exactly or if it's just the meaning, but nonetheless what is meant by this statement is that the sincerity that Sufyan had, rahimahullah. Because the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he mentions, and Shaykh mentions for example the hadith, he says, it comes in the hadith, أسعد الناس بشفاعة يوم القيامة من قال لا إله إلا الله خالصا من قلبه أو نفسه. That the most fortunate people on the day of resurrection are for my intercession is the one who said La ilaha illallah sincerely from his heart or from himself. So how can anyone be guaranteed that his sincerity is solely for Allah? It's a very difficult question. And we know, all of us, we struggle with our intention because the intention changes. So perhaps you begin the lesson or the seeking of knowledge for Allah, and then somewhere in the middle you become confused, and sometimes your intention may become tainted. So you have to continue to strive against it. He also narrates a story, which we'll finish with because it's the finishing of this first point, that is narrated from Umar bin Dhar, rahimahullah, that he said to his father, "O my father, why is it when you preach to the people they are taken by their weeping?" Means they cry. And when others preach to them, they don't cry. He said, "O my son, the bereaved woman who cries is not the same as one who is hired to cry over the dead." So what is intended by this statement is that the one who is sincere and is admonishing the people sincerely, then they're going to be taken by tears because he's sincere. And he's saying this from himself, giving him qawl al-baligh, a nice moving speech, and he's sincere so that people are affected by his speech. As for the one who he's being paid or his intention is not sincere, when he speaks, no one is affected by it. And we also take a benefit from this, that sometimes it may happen that somebody, he may speak to the people and the people are affected by their speech. But it's not a condition that someone's speech is accepted, that everyone has to cry or they have to immediately show that they have been affected. Because someone may be teaching and only after a while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives qabur to this person's da'wah and khair. But we take a benefit from this, that the person who's sincere, inshallah the effects of his da'wah and his talks will be more than the one who's not sincere and he just gives people the knowledge. This narration is reported, what is the Shaykh ascribes it to Ibn Abi Rabbih in Aqad al-Farid, but also I found it in Kitab Hilya, Abu Nu'aym, and Kitab al-Zuhd, Imam Ahmed. Inshallah the narration is sahih. And so here then the Shaykh ends with this part as his first piece of advice, and the second advice he talks about something in relation to the hereafter. Inshallah we'll end with this much. If anyone has any questions or something they want to add or mention. That's a good point. We said last week in the introduction that Shaykh Bakr rahimahullah was expert in Arabic language. Shaykh Uthaymeen admitted himself in the beginning that at times you would need a dictionary to understand him due to his eloquence in Arabic. So therefore the book itself, it needs explanation because he uses a lot of parables and idioms and narrations. So that's why we're reading with the explanation of Shaykh Uthaymeen. But to help the brothers as they read, to get the English translation, which is readily available in PDF or even book form, very inexpensive. And to read alongside of it, because the translation is probably the only translation of the book available, but this helps to make it easier. But yes, it's a difficult read, and every book you read of Shaykh Bakr, you find that uniquely Allah blessed him in the Arabic language, so it's not easy to read. But what you take from his books as well is great benefit, because his work, despite the shortness in size, mashallah, great benefits in them. طيب إن شاء الله. Shaykh Uthaymeen rahimahullah is a contemporary of Shaykh Bakr Zaid, but I believe he's not a student directly of him. From that's what I read from Barak, I'm not sure, because we mentioned last week from the Shaykh Bakr's, at least, well, you can say he's a student in some ways, but I don't know if he directly studied with him, but no doubt he was a contemporary of him. We said the Shaykh's teachers were Shaykh Ibn Baz and Shaykh Shinqiti rahimahullah, amongst others. But he was a contemporary and a senior to Shaykh rahimahullah. So, subhanaka Allah bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.